I stood in the hallway, still clutching the damp towel around my hips, listening to the sound of the front door shutting behind him. A suitcase thudded on the tile, keys landed in the glass bowl near the entrance, and then came that silence. Too familiar, too domestic, too final. He was here. Again. He hadn't been home in years, not really. Always passing through, always in a rush, always somewhere else to be. But now he was staying. Temporarily, of course. That's what my husband said, with the same indifferent tone he used to talk about. Car repairs, or the news. It's just for a few weeks, he's helping with the lake house. And just like that, I became the hostess again. Not the wife, not the woman, just the hostess. When I walked back toward the living room, he was already sitting on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, scrolling through his phone like it owed him something. He looked older, leaner, still young, but carved from something heavier than before. I told myself not to stare. Our first words were dry, polite. He called me you instead of her or mom or anything familial. I asked about work. He answered in syllables. My husband chimed in with some half-hearted joke about us getting along too well already. I laughed. It felt like swallowing glass. The first real moment happened 2 days later. Morning light poured into the kitchen like warm syrup, stretching across the floor toward my bare feet. I was reaching for the mug on the top shelf, and the hem of my robe had lifted just enough. I didn't notice right away, but I felt it. The air shift, the quiet pause behind me. I turned. He looked away, slow, deliberate, and didn't apologize. That night, I stared at myself in the mirror longer than usual. I opened the drawer and touched the folded silk I hadn't worn in years. Not for lack of opportunity, just lack of reason. My husband hadn't looked at me that way in longer than I could count. And now someone had. Not just someone, him. I wore it the next morning under a thick sweater, irrationally aware of how the silk kissed my skin with each breath I took. I poured coffee and asked him about his plans for the day, noticing how he looked at me a second too long before answering. My husband read the newspaper between us, utterly unaware. It wasn't flirtation, not yet. It was tension. It was the raw, magnetic sort of presence that made me stand straighter, speak softer, breathe deeper. I found myself brushing my hair, slower. Choosing clothes not for function, but for feeling. Red lipstick on a Tuesday, perfume for no reason. I started setting the breakfast table even before I brushed my teeth. The hallway became a stage. The staircase, an arena. Each narrow passing between us now held weight. Accidental touches weren't accidents. A shoulder, a wrist, the back of his hand grazing mine as we reached for the same plate. None of it could be explained. All of it could be denied. One afternoon, I was sorting laundry in the basement, the low ceiling, the hum of the dryer, the dust. Mundane. He came down looking for something, I don't remember what, but he stopped when he saw me bending into the basket, my blouse loose at the collar. There was a stillness in that moment. A hanging breath neither of us released. He said, "You look different." I asked how. He shook his head, smiled without humor, and said, "Less tired." It wasn't a compliment, it was a diagnosis. That night, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom watching my husband undress, his back to me. He moved like someone rehearsing. A routine. Fold, hanger, drawer. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the lace cling to my thighs beneath my robe. I wanted him to look at me, not glance. Look. He didn't. We made love out of obligation. Quiet. Efficient. Predictable. I closed my eyes and tried to find something to hold on to. A spark, a scent, a heartbeat. But all I felt was the cool air on my neck and the sound of the clock ticking behind me. The next morning, the first thing I noticed was his cologne. Not my husband's, his. The scent lingered in the hallway, mixed with coffee and sun. A reminder. A challenge. Later that day, I caught myself standing by the window, watching him mow the lawn. He took off his shirt halfway through. I told myself to look away. I didn't. My reflection in the glass watched with me. I knew I should be ashamed. I wasn't. I was curious, alive, awake in a way I hadn't been in years. Something was starting. And even though I didn't know where it would lead, I also knew I wasn't going to stop it. Not yet. The morning was cool despite the clear sky. The kitchen smelled of toast and coffee. And as always, I was the first to wake. Padding around in my slippers, performing the same quiet rituals, I wore a soft beige pajama set, thin and barely opaque, and wrapped a heavy robe over it, not out of modesty, but out of habit. Still, I was acutely aware of how the fabric clung to me beneath it, a private whisper against my skin, as if reminding me I was still a woman, not just a wife. He walked in barefoot, hair messy, eyes heavy with sleep, but alert. He mumbled a morning and went straight to the sink. I didn't answer. I just watched him, his hand braced against the counter, veins lining his forearm. Like rope under taut skin, the simplicity of that posture, effortless, unperformed, felt almost inappropriate to look at. Youth has a way of being unapologetically honest. My husband came down minutes later. Same pajamas he's worn for over a year. The ones I had bought him last Christmas. He kissed the side of my head and sat at the table. I felt his lips touch my temple, but nothing stirred in me. No warmth, no reflex, just the familiar tick of routine being completed. One check mark on a long list of mornings. The conversation at breakfast was predictable. News, traffic, weekend rain forecasts. He spoke more to his son than to me, and I was grateful for that. It gave me room to watch, to observe, to compare, to feel the subtle, invisible things I couldn't explain, not even to myself. Later, I had errands to run, groceries, a hair appointment, the post office, all mundane. He offered to drive me casually, like it didn't matter. But it did. I said yes before I could think of a reason to say no. In the car, I sat quietly, the seatbelt pulling slightly at my coat. At every stoplight, my thigh nudged closer to his, and I didn't move it away. He turned on music without asking. A low, gravelly male voice sang about things women weren't supposed to say aloud. I stared out the window, but I could feel his breath, the way his fingers tightened and relaxed around the steering wheel. I didn't need to look to know that I was being noticed. We parked near my office. He didn't immediately reach for the keys. I adjusted my coat, grabbed my bag, and was about to open the door when he spoke. Not loudly, but clearly, he said my name. For the first time, I turned. His face was close, not close enough to touch, but close enough that it changed the air. The space between us thickened, like the pause between lightning and thunder. We didn't move, just stared, caught in something unspoken and unsafe. Then he leaned forward, slowly, carefully, like someone stepping onto thin ice. His lips brushed mine, tentative at first, barely there. The kiss wasn't bold or hungry. It was quiet, testing, almost reverent, and yet it lit something in me that had been silent for too long. I didn't pull away. My body leaned in before my mind gave it permission. For a moment, I forgot about consequences, about names, about roles. There was only his mouth, his breath, and the overwhelming sensation of being seen. I broke the kiss first, not because I regretted it, but because I couldn't handle how much I wanted more. My heart was hammering, not in my chest, but in my throat. He didn't say a word, neither did I. I opened the door and stepped out. The lobby of the office building felt cold and sterile. Too bright and too loud. Every paper, every phone ringing, every voice. It all felt distant. Plastic. I sat at my desk for hours, reading the same sentences, unable to process any of them. My mind was still back there, in that car, in that kiss. Not out of guilt, but out of craving. The hunger that surfaced didn't ask for forgiveness. It asked for repetition. I walked home instead of calling a ride. I needed the time. Each block, each step, was like shedding a layer of denial. By the time I reached the front door, I was certain of only one thing. If it happened again, I wouldn't resist. That evening, my husband came home and wrapped his arms around me from behind. I flinched, not because of surprise, but because my body no longer responded. It wasn't rejection, it was absence. Nothing registered. Later, before bed, I opened my closet and reached for the lace lingerie I hadn't touched in years. Not for him, for me, for the version of myself I thought I'd buried under chores and anniversaries. I wore it beneath my robe as I brushed my hair, standing in front of the mirror, studying my reflection like a stranger. The silk felt like a secret against my thighs. A secret I didn't want to confess, because I wanted it to happen again. And that terrified me less than the idea that it might not. I had barely slept. Not because of guilt, but because of how vividly I could still feel his lips. Soft, certain, terrifying. I kept replaying it, not in search of meaning, but in search of sensation. There was a texture to it I couldn't forget. The slight tremble in his breath, the coolness of his skin, the heat that settled between my ribs like a slow-burning coal. Morning came too soon. My husband was leaving town for 2 days, an annual construction expo 2 states over. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't sudden. He had mentioned it a dozen times. I had nodded, smiled, pretended to care, but this time I cared in a different way. Not because of what it meant for him, but because of what it meant for me. For us, I cooked breakfast, though I wasn't hungry. The eggs sizzled too loudly. The toast smelled burnt. He packed in the living room while I stood in the kitchen, feeling my heart rise into my throat each time he called my name from across the house. I answered with practiced cheerfulness. Nothing sounded off, but everything felt different. As he stood by the door, suitcase in hand, he kissed my forehead and said, "You'll be okay here?" I nodded. "Of course," I replied, smiling just right. He smiled too, with that familiar, weightless warmth, completely unaware, completely trusting. When the door shut behind him, I didn't move. I stood there for a full minute, staring at the space he had just vacated. The silence left in his absence was a breathing thing, expanding and contracting through the walls, the furniture, the floorboards. I walked barefoot to the kitchen and made a second cup of coffee, this one for myself. It tasted stronger. I needed it to be. He came down late, showered, dressed, cleaner than usual. I noticed his hair was still damp, the scent of his cologne mixing with the steam he carried in his skin. He didn't sit right away, just leaned against the counter, watching me butter toast like it was something delicate. I didn't ask if he wanted any. I didn't need to. "I'll be in the garage later," he said casually. "Dad left a bunch of stuff in boxes." I nodded, barely looking up. "Let me know if you need help," I murmured, then turned to the sink, letting the hot water rush over the dishes until steam clouded the window in front of me. He went out half an hour later. I waited 10 minutes before following. Not because I was hesitant, because I needed that pause to gather myself. I had changed into jeans and a loose cardigan over a camisole. No bra. I told myself it was because of the heat. The lie barely lasted the walk through the hallway. The garage was a mess of dusty boxes, tools, old furniture, and forgotten things that smelled like time. He had cleared a small corner and was crouched near a box of old newspapers and tool catalogs. I stood by the doorway a moment before stepping in. He turned his head briefly, offered a soft, "Hey," then kept working. I didn't answer, just picked up a smaller box and knelt beside him, brushing cobwebs from the lid. We worked in silence for a while, him on one side, me on the other, our backs to each other, the air heavy with the scent of cardboard and oil, and then his voice, low and unexpectedly personal. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked. I paused, hand frozen on an old photo album. I didn't ask what he meant. I knew. "No," I said. "That's not how it works." My voice was calm, almost practiced. He looked at me then, over his shoulder, eyes narrow with something unreadable. "But do you ever want to?" I didn't answer. I didn't move. He waited, then turned away. It was just a question, but it wasn't. He pulled out an old framed photo, me, my husband, and him at some graduation. We were all smiling. I barely remembered the day he handed it to me and said, "We looked happy." "We were," I said, "were." He didn't press, just let the word hang there like smoke. Later, we took a break. I brought out cold lemonade and 2 glasses. We sat on the back steps, not talking. The sun was high, casting slow-moving shadows across the lawn. I watched the sweat bead along his collarbone, the way he rested his forearms on his knees, fingers interlaced. It's strange, he said suddenly. Being here like this, it feels like everything's exactly the same, but also off. I didn't look at him. I stared at the grass, the fence, the hose coiled in a heap. That's how houses work, I said. They don't move, we do. When I went inside, I didn't go straight to the kitchen. I went to the mirror in the hallway and stared at my reflection. There was color in my cheeks I hadn't seen in years, a flush that wasn't from heat. My lips looked fuller, my eyes more alert. I looked like a version of myself I hadn't met. In a long time, that evening, he helped me with dinner. My hands brushed his twice. He didn't move. The third time, I left mine there for a second longer. He looked at me, and there was no hesitation in his eyes this time. Only patience. Only presence. We ate with plates too close together on the kitchen island, the air between us charged like storm clouds on the edge of breaking. Afterward, as I loaded the dishwasher, I felt his gaze again. The way his eyes traveled. Not lewd, not casual, like someone seeing color for the first time after living in grayscale. I didn't speak. I let the silence say it. That night, I lay in bed beside a man who was miles away in his sleep, while just down the hall, another man couldn't sleep at all. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the worst part of myself. Felt like the truest. The following morning unfolded slowly, like something being unwrapped layer by layer. The sky outside had that pale winter light, brilliant but cold, and the house felt too quiet, as if even the walls had begun holding their breath. I stood by the window in the hallway, staring at the leafless trees and the neighbor's dog barking at nothing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface of my life, quietly and permanently, like a crack forming beneath still ice. My husband wouldn't be back until the next day. I had said that out loud to no one in particular more than once that morning. I wasn't waiting for anyone to hear. I was just saying it to the air as if naming his absence made it more legitimate. I cleaned the countertops twice, rearranged the books on the coffee table, changed the water in the vase even though the flowers had already wilted. I wasn't restless. I was prepared. I didn't know for what, but I felt it coming, mid-morning. I found the Christmas decorations tucked away in the hall closet, a dusty box full of tangled lights, mismatched ornaments, old holiday cards. Normally, I would have waited for my husband to return so we could do it together, like we always did. But nothing about this week felt like always. He came downstairs while I was testing the string lights across the back of the couch. His steps were slow, cautious, almost too quiet for a man his size. I knew he'd been watching me from the landing for a few seconds before entering the tar room. I didn't acknowledge it. I just kept untangling the lights, pretending not to notice the way my own hands shook slightly. He walked over without saying anything and started helping, plugging in the other end of the string and holding it out so I could inspect the bulbs. We worked in silence again, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was full of unfinished thoughts, avoided questions, eyes that met for too long and looked away too quickly. I had chosen a dress that morning I hadn't worn in over a year. Dark blue, soft cotton, fitted enough to remind me of my waistline. I hadn't worn a bra beneath it, partly because the neckline didn't require it, partly because I wanted to feel the movement. I noticed the way his eyes lingered on the shape of me each time I bent forward to retrieve another ornament. He didn't speak, but his gaze was steady, deliberate, like a hand hovering just above my skin. At one point, I dropped a glass ornament. It shattered, sharp and sudden. I gasped, stepping back instinctively, and he was beside me before I could react. His hand touched my arm, not forcefully but firmly, steadying, grounding. His fingers stayed there for just a second too long. I didn't move. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Fine, just startled me." He bent down to gather the shards, and I watched the curve of his spine, the quiet focus in his movements. I should have stopped staring, but I didn't. Something in me was dissolving. A boundary, an agreement, an identity. I no longer knew what role I was playing. When the tree was finally lit, the room looked warmer, softer. He stood back and admired it, hands in his pockets, jaw clenched. I was standing beside him, closer than I needed to be. I said something about how my husband always put the star on last, and he glanced at me with something sharp in his eyes, something like disbelief. "Why didn't you wait for him?" he asked, but it didn't sound like an accusation. Because I didn't want to, I said, and the words surprised even me. I wasn't making a statement. I was telling the truth. We sat on the couch afterward, tired but not relaxed. I tucked one leg beneath me, smoothing my dress without thinking. He was watching again. I could feel it in the way the room shifted around his stillness, a kind of quiet gravity. I reached for a box of old photos and handed it to him. A distraction, a deflection. But when he opened it and started flipping through, the air didn't ease, it thickened. He paused at a photo, one of me and my husband on the beach, both of us laughing, the wind in my hair, his arm around my shoulders. We looked young. I couldn't. Remember if we were happy? Did he take that? He asked. I think so, I said. That was before everything got quiet. He nodded slowly, then put the photo aside without comment. I watched his profile, how his jaw moved slightly when he swallowed, how his hand rested too close to my knee. I didn't shift away. Later that afternoon, the heater kicked on and filled the room with soft white noise. I sat with a book I wasn't reading, my mind wandering, my body still humming from the proximity. He passed behind me on his way to the kitchen and his hand brushed against the back of my neck, barely there like the wind catching loose strands of hair. But I felt it for minutes after, that night. I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom and looked at myself again. I didn't look different, not exactly, but I felt different, like something under my skin had turned its face toward the light for the first time in years. I traced the curve of my shoulder in the mirror and thought of his fingers. I left the dress on the chair, the silk slip beneath it still warm from my skin. When I crawled into bed, I didn't close my eyes right away. I listened for his steps, for any sound. From the hallway, none came, but in my dreams, I heard him whisper my name again, and I didn't pretend not to answer. It rained that morning, not heavily, but in that insistent, endless way that made the world outside feel like a blurred painting. The windows fogged from the inside, and the house grew quiet in a different way. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of waiting. The kind that thickens with everything unspoken. My husband would return that evening, but the hours between now and then felt stretched, suspended, like a long breath held too long. I moved through the morning deliberately, folding laundry with unnecessary precision, wiping already clean counters, reorganizing drawers that didn't need organizing. Everything I touched reminded me that I was not alone in the house. Not truly. I could feel his presence behind every door, every footstep on the creaking floorboards, every shift in the rhythm of the walls. It was as if the house itself had become complicit. I told myself I wouldn't see him, that I would keep my distance, that what happened, the kiss, the looks, the touches that weren't touches, would remain as it was, suspended, unacted upon, a fantasy preserved in silence. But then the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door to find him standing there, jacket soaked, a paper bag in one hand. He had gone out without telling me. Got your favorite, he said, holding up the bag, from that little place near the bookstore. His hair dripped at the temples. His shirt clung to his chest. I hesitated. He stepped. Inside, we ate in the kitchen at opposite ends of the table. The smell of roasted garlic and rain filled the air between us. We didn't speak much, just the occasional comment about the weather, the traffic, the flavor, mundane, forgettable things, except none of them were forgettable now. Every glance, every motion, every silence was charged. I couldn't meet his eyes for long. After lunch, he suggested a drive. Just to get out, he said. Clear the head. I should have said no, I didn't. The rain had slowed to a mist, the kind that seemed to melt into the pavement. We drove in silence, windows fogging slightly, the windshield wipers squeaking every few seconds. I stared out at the gray skyline, feeling the air inside the car grow warmer, closer, the kind of warmth that makes your skin too aware of itself. He parked in the underground lot of the shopping center and turned off the engine. We sat in the stillness. Neither of us moved. I was the first to speak. We shouldn't be doing this. I know. His voice was low, flat, not defensive. I'm not someone who I began, but the rest didn't come. You don't have to explain. He turned toward me, slow, deliberate. And that's when it happened. Without fanfare, without warning. He leaned in and I didn't stop him. I didn't flinch. This time, the kiss wasn't gentle or tentative. It was full, deliberate, drawn from something deeper than either of us had admitted. His hand found the side of my neck, fingers just under the line of my jaw, steady and warm. I responded before I thought, my mouth opening slightly, breathing in him. The moment, the danger, the need. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't confusion. This was decision. When we finally parted, I didn't speak. I rested my head back against the seat and closed my eyes, trying to catch my breath. My heart was thudding in places I didn't know could pulse. He stayed still, watching me. I could feel it. We didn't say anything on the drive back. The car hummed, the rain picked up again, and the world outside blurred into shades of gray and red taillights. At home, I went straight to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I undressed slowly, piece by piece, letting each article fall to the floor like something I no longer needed. Standing under the hot water, I traced the curve of my own shoulder, the rise of my collarbone, and wondered how long it had been since I touched myself without obligation. Without distraction, I didn't want to scrub the feeling away. I wanted to memorize it. I wanted to feel everything more fully. My skin, my body, the way it responded to memory and heat. I wrapped myself in a towel and stood at the sink, watching my own reflection. My lips were redder than usual. My cheeks flushed. I looked like I had just run from something, or toward it. That evening, I dressed carefully. Not for my husband's return, but because I wanted to feel the same when I looked in the mirror. I chose a long, dark skirt that moved when I walked, and a soft cream blouse that clung subtly to the sides of my ribs. Underneath, I wore nothing that didn't make me feel beautiful. When my husband came through the door hours later, he smelled of travel and fatigue. He kissed my cheek and complimented the dinner I had reheated from the night before. We sat at the table and talked about nothing. I nodded, smiled, answered. He didn't notice anything different, but I had changed. After he went to bed, I stood in the hallway for a long time, lights off, the house lit only by the Christmas tree in the corner of the living room. Its glow pulsed softly against the walls, as if breathing. I pressed my fingers to my lips and felt the echo of that kiss still, there, refusing to fade. I didn't know where we were going, but I knew now that we had already crossed the line, and I didn't want to go back. The next few days passed in a hush, like the aftermath of a storm that no one wanted to acknowledge. My husband settled back into the house as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Every movement I made felt like an echo of something that had already happened. Every smile I forced felt like a betrayal. Not because I didn't mean it, but because part of me now lived elsewhere, in a silence, in a memory. In a breath I hadn't released since the car ride, I found myself studying him more. My husband, his face, his habits, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he read emails, the way he sighed at the television. These were things I had known, things I once loved, things that no longer touched me in the same place. It wasn't that he had changed. It was that I had begun to see him through a different lens, a filtered image, dulled and distant. He reached for me that night, in bed. Nothing urgent, just a hand on my hip, lips against the curve of my shoulder. It was his way of being intimate, quiet, rehearsed, with kindness. But I didn't feel desire. I felt only compliance. My body responded, out of memory, out of rhythm, out of habit. And the entire time, I stared at the ceiling, wondering what it meant to go through the motions when the meaning had moved somewhere else. Afterwards, I lay awake, my back to him, eyes open in the dark. I wasn't grieving. I wasn't afraid. I was simply aware of how far I had drifted, not toward something, but away. The next morning, I dressed differently. Something looser, but cut closer to the waist, something I hadn't worn in months. My husband was already gone for work, and the silence in the house wrapped around me like a second skin. Down the hall, a door creaked, floorboards shifted, water ran. He was awake. I found him in the kitchen, shirtless, drinking orange juice from the carton. He turned when I entered and smiled. That lazy, lopsided smile that somehow always carried mischief and apology in equal measure. I said nothing. He set the carton down slowly like someone aware he'd been caught, but not sorry for it. Later that day, we found ourselves in the same room too often. Not by design, not consciously, but something had shifted in our movements. We no longer avoided. We hovered. We moved in parallel, like magnets not yet allowed to touch. That afternoon, I mentioned the lake house, the repairs, the clutter. He offered to drive, said we could get it done faster together. I didn't hesitate. The drive took an hour. The silence between us was no longer uncomfortable. It was loaded. We passed familiar landscapes, gas stations, fields, abandoned barns, and yet nothing felt familiar. My hands rested in my lap, still, but I could feel their pulse in my wrists. My breath came shallow and measured. At the house, we moved like two people pretending to have a task. We opened windows to air the place out, unboxed old lamps, cleaned shelves that didn't need cleaning, but the tension lived between every gesture. Every time I passed behind him, I was aware of how close. Every time our arms brushed, I felt heat. There was a moment near the upstairs bedroom. I stood in the doorway, watching him adjust the curtains. The light hit his back in a way that turned everything gold and sharp. He turned and caught me looking. Neither of us looked away. "You okay?" he asked. I didn't answer. I stepped into the room. He stood still, waiting, reading, listening to something unspoken. I didn't touch him. Not yet. I just walked past, close enough for my shoulder to graze his arm. I could feel the way he inhaled. Shallow. Sudden. We stood like that, too close to be innocent, too still to be nothing. Then I sat down on the edge of the bed, slowly, folding my hands in my lap, eyes fixed on the floor. "This is a bad idea," I said, but my voice wasn't convincing. He didn't reply. He crossed the room, stood in front of me, and knelt. His hand brushed the hem of my dress, fingertips grazing my knee, not possessively, not confidently, just lightly, asking. I looked up. The air between us broke. I leaned in first, not fast, not impulsive. It was a surrender. His lips met mine, slower. This time, deeper. Not rushed. His hand moved to my thigh, steady, grounding me. My fingers found the back of his neck, drawing him closer. We stayed like that, wrapped in something fragile and overwhelming. We didn't speak for a long time after. We didn't need to. On the drive home, I rolled down the window slightly, let the cold air sting my cheeks. I didn't want to lose the feeling. I didn't want to pretend it hadn't happened. When we got back, I went straight to the bathroom and sat on the closed toilet lid, fully clothed, trembling. Not from fear, not from regret, but from the weight of finally doing what I had only allowed myself to imagine. That night, my husband said he had a late meeting the next day. I nodded. My voice stayed even, but in my chest, I already knew where I would be. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight that didn't match the hour. It was too bright, too loud, cutting through the blinds with the precision of a scalpel. My husband had left early, his absence marked only by the folded corner of the duvet, the faint smell of his cologne on the pillow, and the sound of silence that filled the bedroom like fog. I didn't get up right away. I stayed in bed longer than usual, eyes open, body still, letting the weight of what had happened press into the mattress around me. Down the hallway, I could hear the television humming low, barely audible. I didn't need to wonder who had turned it on. When I stepped into the kitchen, he was already there. Hair damp from a shower, shirt unbuttoned at the collar, fingertips grazing the rim of his coffee mug. The same mug my husband used. I paused in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and watched him for a second too long. His eyes met mine across the room. Not surprised, not embarrassed, just steady. Neither of us spoke. I poured myself a glass of water and drank it slowly, every swallow measured, as if I could wash away the feeling from the inside out. But it didn't leave. It had rooted itself too deeply now, into my breath, my spine, my skin. By midday, the air in the house had grown unbearably still, Every creak in the floor, every sigh from the vents felt amplified. I busied myself with irrelevant tasks, changing sheets, sorting drawers, wiping windows that didn't need wiping. He moved through the rooms like a second pulse, always near but never quite touching. We existed like charged particles, orbiting the same space with dangerous precision. Then came the knock. It was the kind of knock that comes not from surprise but from purpose. Measured, deliberate, and meant for me. I opened the door to find my husband standing there, earlier than expected, briefcase in one hand, his phone pressed to his ear. He ended the call, smiled, and leaned in to kiss me. I let him. He stepped past me and into the living room. I followed, slow, my breath catching. Down the hall, I could hear a door close softly, almost respectfully, as if he had heard my husband's voice, as if he understood what it meant. We had dinner together. That night, the three of us. It was surreal. Like sitting inside a painting of my own life, watching myself move in real time through scenes I no longer belonged to. I smiled when appropriate, made small talk when prompted. My husband spoke about work, about a new project downtown, about a colleague's divorce. He laughed when he said it was a mess, and I couldn't stop my eyes from flicking towards the younger man at the other end of the table. He didn't laugh. I excused myself halfway through, retreating to the bathroom. I locked the door behind me and sat on the edge of the tub, hands pressed to my face as if I could hide from what I was becoming later that evening. After the dishes were done and the lights dimmed, I stood by the window in the bedroom, robe loosely tied at my waist, looking out into the yard. The tree branches shifted gently in the wind, casting long shadows on the grass like fingers reaching for something they could never touch. I didn't hear him come in. I turned slightly when I felt it. That invisible change in the room, the way the air thickened, the way the silence curved around something unspoken. He stood just inside the doorway, barefoot, quiet, eyes locked on mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and turned back. To the window, I heard the door close behind him, not loud, but final. The next morning, my husband kissed me on the cheek and left for work. He said he'd be home late again. I didn't ask why. I cleaned the house slowly, deliberately. Each room felt like it held pieces of secrets. I could still smell him. In the hallway, on the back of the couch, in the laundry basket. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the version of me that surfaced when he was near. The woman. Who laughed differently. Who moved with awareness. Who no longer pretended she didn't notice. By late afternoon, I was sitting on the back porch with a cup of tea gone cold. The sky had turned an early shade of blue-gray. Clouds gathering over the rooftops. He stepped outside without shoes, leaning against the railing beside me. He didn't sit. He just stood there, looking out at the sky. "We shouldn't stay here," he said, voice quiet. I didn't answer. "I don't mean this minute," he added. "Just not like this." The truth of it landed heavily. Not like this. Not in stolen moments. Not in silences and half-glances and the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. But what would the alternative be? I turned to him slowly. He looked tired, not in body, but in spirit, as if he was already carrying the guilt for something he hadn't yet done. "Then how?" I asked. He didn't answer, and I didn't press him. That night, I watched my husband sleep and wondered how many parts of myself I had given away without ever realizing it. Not to another man, but to time, to duty, to routine, to the slow erosion of feeling. I didn't sleep. I lay awake, one arm under the pillow, one foot pressed against the cool sheet, thinking of the man sleeping down the hall, thinking of how it had started, of how impossible it already felt to stop. The following days blurred into each other with a soft, aching persistence. Each morning arrived quietly, no longer bringing anticipation but tension, measured and deliberate. My movements became smaller, my choices more calculated. I had entered a place where desire no longer whispered from a distance but stood next to me in every room, refusing to be ignored. My husband had grown more affectionate lately. Little gestures, a kiss on the neck while I cooked, a squeeze of the hand during a drive, asking me twice if I was warm enough in the evenings, as if he sensed something slipping. But it wasn't guilt that made me notice his touch. It was contrast. His fingers, though warm, no longer set anything inside me alight. They simply reminded me of where the fire used to be. He spoke about a weekend away, a cabin rental just outside the city, a chance to reconnect, he said. I nodded, smiled, told him it sounded lovely. Inside, I felt my ribs tighten. It wasn't the idea of being alone with him that disturbed me. It was the fact that I knew I wouldn't feel alone at all. I would carry someone else with me, someone younger, someone I had already chosen in ways I couldn't undo. I spent more time outside, gardening, pretending to prune, lingering near the fence line where the light always felt softer in the afternoons. He watched from the upstairs window once. I didn't have to look to know. I felt it the way you feel the heat of a hand before it touches you. He didn't come down, but the next day, there were new blooms on the windowsill in the kitchen, wildflowers. Arranged in the jar I usually used for pickles. We didn't speak about it. We had found our own language. One of glances, of passing footsteps, of shared silence that said more than words could. When I poured coffee, I left the spoon by his cup. When he brought in the mail, he left mine on top. When I stood at the sink, he walked closer than necessary. Always just enough to feel, never enough to act. One evening, as the light dipped into amber, I found myself in the guest room folding towels. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. I could feel his eyes trace the curve of my back, the exposed line of my calf. I straightened, slowly, holding the last towel longer than needed. When I finally turned, he hadn't moved. I didn't step away. The air stretched between us like thread, delicate and humming. I should have walked past him. Instead, I waited. I'm leaving. Next week, he said suddenly. Where? He hesitated. Back to the city? My job wants me full-time again? I nodded. My hands trembled slightly, and I tightened my grip on the towel. How long? Maybe a while. I swallowed. The room shifted. He took a step closer. His voice, lower now. I wasn't going to say anything yet, I thought. Maybe it'd be easier not to. Easier for who? He didn't answer. I set the towel down, neatly, as if this small act could preserve something I didn't know how to keep. A part of me wanted to ask him to stay. Another part knew that asking would break the fragile truth we'd been living. Inside, later that night, when the house was quiet, I stood in front of my closet, touching the edge of a dress I hadn't worn in years. It was elegant, simple, almost old-fashioned. My husband had once said it made me look like someone out of a painting. Back when words like that still had weight, I put it on, slowly, every no movement deliberate. Underneath, a slip of lace hugged my hips, delicate and precise. I applied lipstick in silence, choosing the deeper red, the one that made my reflection pause, as if it too didn't quite recognize me. I didn't have a plan. I only knew I needed to feel something true. I found him in the kitchen, standing by the open fridge, a glass of water half full in his hand. When he looked up, something in him stilled. I didn't speak. I walked past him, letting the scent of my perfume trail behind me like a signal. At the base of the stairs, I turned slightly and said, "Walk with me?" He followed. We stepped out into the night without jackets. The air was crisp and the street lamps cast long golden lines across the pavement. We didn't walk far, just to the edge of the street, where the trees leaned in and the world felt quieter. I don't want this to end like a secret, I said finally. He was silent for a long moment. Then, it was never a secret to me. I nodded, eyes stinging. I just don't know what I'm supposed to do now. Maybe you're not supposed to do anything. The wind caught a strand of my hair and lifted it gently against his shoulder. He reached out, pushed it behind my ear. His fingers brushed the side of my face, and I closed my eyes. Stay tonight, I whispered. Not in your room. Not as a guest. His breath caught. Then he stepped back, slowly. I can't. Not like this. Then how? I asked again. This time, he didn't turn away. He reached for my hand, took it lightly in his. His thumb traced the edge of my wrist, a motion so intimate it nearly broke me. I don't want to be what makes you unhappy, he said. Even if I'm what makes you feel alive. We stood like that for minutes, neither moving, the night wrapping around us like a truth we were still too afraid to hold. When we finally went back inside, we didn't touch again. But as I lay in bed next to my husband's sleeping body, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the outline of his hand still pressed against mine. And I knew what came next would change everything. The morning light came too softly, as if it knew it wasn't welcome. I opened my eyes not from rest, but from weight. A weight in my chest, in my arms, in the space between what had happened and what could no longer be undone. My husband was already gone, his side of the bed still warm but vacant, echoing his absence in a way that felt louder than his presence ever had. I lay still, letting the silence do what it always did, wrap around me like an answer I wasn't brave enough to face. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't go downstairs. I simply sat at the edge of the bed and stared at the pattern on the floor, the quiet fibers of the rug that had been there longer than either of us realized. Everything around me was unchanged, yet I felt unrecognizable to myself. Not broken, not even guilty, just foreign, like a stranger had slipped into my life and decided not to leave. When I finally walked downstairs, the house felt hollow. Even though I wasn't alone, I could sense him. One room over, his breath steady, his movements measured. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The line had been crossed, not just with a kiss, not just with a glance, but in every moment of unspoken want that had finally been given shape. I passed him in the hallway. Our arms brushed. Neither of us stopped. The day unraveled quietly. My hands moved through chores with a mind of their own. Laundry, dishes, half-hearted attempts at order. He helped without being asked. When he reached above me to place a glass, on the top shelf, his body grazed mine. It lasted less than a second, but it split the air. I could feel every inch of him for the next hour. My skin buzzed, my breath shortened, and I found myself standing in front of the mirror in the guest bathroom, staring into my own eyes, wondering who this woman was. When he told me he was leaving, it didn't come as a shock. He said it softly, standing by the back door, sunlight framing his shoulders. He had taken a job back in the city. He didn't know when he'd be back. Maybe never. I nodded, lips pressed, voice locked away somewhere between restraint and devastation. He took a step forward. "Say something," he said. "What is there to say?" He paused. "That you want me to stay?" I turned away. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't ask someone else to be brave for a choice I was still too afraid to make. I went for a walk after he left. The streets were quiet, the air thick with the threat of rain. I walked with no direction, letting my feet move while my mind replayed it all. His eyes, his hands, the way my name sounded in his mouth the moment before everything changed. When I came back, the house felt impossibly still. No music, no TV, just the quiet hum of something unfinished. I went to the kitchen, picked up a dish towel, and began wiping a countertop that didn't need wiping. That's when I noticed the envelope unmarked, folded once, tucked beneath the corner of the fruit bowl. Like it didn't want to be found, inside was a note. Just a few lines. "I didn't mean to make you feel alive only to disappear, but I'd rather leave with truth than stay in silence." I didn't cry. Not right away. I folded the note again, slowly, carefully, like it might cut me if I moved too fast. Then I sat down and wept, not because I lost something, but because I had finally touched something real and let it go. That night, my husband held me in bed. He whispered something about how good it felt to be home, about how we should make more time for just us. I murmured agreement. My arms wrapped around him, my body obeyed. But inside, I was somewhere else. Not with the man who had left. Not with the one who had stayed. But with the version of myself I had almost become, a woman who wasn't afraid to feel everything, a woman who would now have to live with what she'd tasted and what she had chosen to walk away from. Because the truth was, even though no one else knew, I was already changed. And no matter how many more mornings came, I would never again be the woman I was before him.